Hello and welcome to this webinar, Fighting For and Against Polarized Attitudes of Belarusians and the Regime in the War in Ukraine. My name is Ann Helge and I'm the coordinator of the Swedish Civil Society Network for Eastern Partnership and Russia at ForumCiv. And this webinar is organized within the frames of this network in coordination between ForumCiv and Sveriges Belarusier. On 24th February, Russia began a war against Ukraine, including missiles fired from bases in Belarus. Lukashenko openly supports the military intervention. Recent surveys, including a public opinion poll conducted by the British think tank Chatham House, show that the majority of Belarusians oppose the war and support Ukraine. During this 60-minute webinar, our three panelists will discuss the political situation in Ukraine during the war, how Belarusians feel about their country's involvement in Ukraine, how they support Ukrainians, and implications of the war on the future of Belarus. Let me introduce the moderator of today's webinar, Alesia Rudnik, political scientist, PhD candidate in political science, and member of Sveriges Belarusier. Alesia.
Thank you, Anne, for your kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here and to be speaking with the experienced moderators, who is experienced speakers on the very important topic that's an important issue for many Belarusians today, as we have experienced as Belarusian community outside the country and as Belarusians inside the country. We have experienced the huge political crisis for 2 years ago, and currently Ukraine is in a much worse situation, but Belarusians' problems remain on place, and we would like to devote this webinar to discussing those issues and specifically how Belarusians' attitudes look today when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So on February 24th, the lives of billions of people have been changed. Some had to flee the country, others had to help refugees and to support their relatives who are coming from Ukraine. For thousands, the war has separated the families. Not least has the war changed attitudes between the nations. While ties between Russia and Ukraine were significantly challenged already in 2014, attitudes of Ukrainians towards Belarus or Belarusians have never been worse than today. For example, the recent poll from a rating group shows that 96% of Ukrainians looked at Belarus as hostile country. Interestingly, 45% of Ukrainians claimed to support Lukashenko in August 2020, and today this number is dropped only by 2%. Belarusians in turn have expressed multifaceted support to Ukraine, from donations to the military division formed by the Belarusians for a couple of months ago or since the start of the war. Today we will talk about these attitudes of Belarusians towards the war. We will discuss the contrasts between the regime and the nation, as well as we'll discuss the attitudes of Ukrainians towards Belarusians. The speakers who will join me today are Dr. Alina Zubkovych, researcher on contemporary Ukraine and the head of Nordic Ukraine Forum. Welcome, Alina. We have together with us Pavel Slunkin, who is a policy analyst at European Council of Foreign Relations. Welcome, Pavel. And finally, we have Dr. Vasil Navumau, who is a visiting researcher at IRIS, Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. Welcome, Vasil. Let us get back to the events that Belarus faced during the last years and discuss how can we describe Belarus before the start of the war in Ukraine. Vasil, let's start with you. How would you describe the political context of Belarus and the life of ordinary Belarusians during the last year? And what were the attitudes towards neighbors? What are the geopolitical preferences of Belarusians? And finally, maybe media consumption of Belarusians. How can we describe all that? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Before going and answering your question, I just would like to make a little correction. I'm not a visiting researcher at IRIS. I'm affiliated to IRIS, and I think that, in academic terms, that it's quite an important difference, because I'm currently working in another institution at Ruhr University Bochum. But anyway, thank you for a wonderful question. Speaking about the political context, current political context, largely it has been obviously defined by the 2020's presidential elections in Belarus and repressions that followed that. In fact, Belarusian authorities, they started burning out the civil society dimension, and many people were forced to leave the country. A lot of them were imprisoned, beaten, tortured, and since the time as the long-awaited kind of changes did not happen, political changes did not happen, many of people were kind of forced to act from abroad or try to contribute to their changes from within the countries in a kind of concealed fashion. So it should be said that a larger part of the population has not been supported Lukashenko, and his popularity significantly decreased since 2020s, because before he managed to retain some kind of popularity even among Belarusians, thanks to the various mechanisms of repression, cooptation, and also he had certain legitimacy. But after the elections, which were rigged, and the repressions, he is being supported only about maybe 30% of the population, as has been evidenced by the survey conducted by Center for East European International.
Okay, I guess that Vasil is out of the internet, so let us just wait for a couple of seconds before we can understand whether this problem can be solved within short. But I suggest that we then can return to Vasil later and discuss what are the life of ordinary Belarusians within the last years. And here we have Vasil again. Vasil, please continue.
Problem, right?
Yes, we hear you now.
It says that host. Okay, yeah. So yeah, what about the current situation? I could refer to another survey conducted by Vardamatsky's analytical laboratory, where the method of phone calls, and more than 50% Belarusians tend to remain neutral. I mean, speaking about the political orientation, and they do not want to neither join NATO nor collective security treaty organization. This is quite a pronounced trend since 90s, as Vardamatsky himself has said. And also after the war launched has been by Russia, the number of people sympathizing Russia also decreased, while a rotation towards the European Union increased. Finally, the last part of the question related to media consumption, and as for the consumption of specific media content, about 22% of Belarusians primarily relate to non-state media, independent media, and 20% to Belarusian and Russian media channels, and about 12% to Russian independent media channels. Still, about 80% do not follow events in Ukraine at all, and this is the data that has been provided by the Chatham House survey that has been already mentioned. So, I mean, speaking about, so just to summarize, Belarusians, the larger part of Belarusians remain against the invasion of Russia into war, and even among these severe repressions that has been launched by Belarusian authorities, they still were participating in anti-war various demonstrations, and were showing support and loyalty towards the Ukrainians. They in various ways helped them. So I think that this is one of the things that both international community and Belarusians themselves take into account, and that they still remain kind of against the war on the grassroots level. Thanks.
Thank you, Vasil. Let me just follow up shortly with the small questions regarding the media consumption. Maybe we don't have numbers, but how would you describe the consumption of news by Belarusians when it comes to TV? Because we know that in Russia, the majority of population does consume the news via the TV and state TV programs. What would you say about Belarusians? Does television, radio, and official channels play the similar role as, for example, in Russia? Even though if we don't have any numbers, maybe you have some reflection regarding that.
I think that there has been numbers mentioned in one of Zoe's, this German research center reports. I think it was in beginning of 2021, when they also analyzed the level of like popularity of Belarusian TV channels, and among Belarusians, and about 15% of population have been regularly using and relying to this as the primary source of information about the world. And about 70% of people said that internet and social media presents the primary source of information about the events in the world. So this means that also there has been, as far as I remember, there has been a correlation between those with low education, with high education, who also prefer social media and, for example, Telegram channels instead of watching TV channels. And I think that this also largely reflects the latest events in Belarus, when in fact the state media became like the main channel of propaganda and disinformation about the main events with regards to 2020's presidential elections. And to a large extent also Belarusian narratives, propagandist narratives, merged with Russian ones, since we know a lot of Russian media professionals came to Belarus after our journalists have been dismissed by the authorities and were forced to leave the country or were imprisoned by the authorities. So, and also, I mean, Belarus has quite a good internet penetration, which is also really like main fundament for people to be engaged into social media and internet channels. And they have been also extensively using and relying on Telegram channels, for example, Nechta Live, when the protests in Belarus occurred. So all this creates the foundations for Belarusians to just gather their primary information from social media, internet. Yes.
Thank you, Vasil. And let us move on to the other side of Belarusian reality and talk about the actions and foreign policy of the Belarusian authorities. that are recognized by international community primarily, and by Belarusians themselves as illegitimate to a certain degree. And Pavel, I would like to ask you to summarize, to give us an overview of the foreign policy of official Minsk after 2020, after the events that we've seen after the presidential election in August. What were the relations of Minsk and Moscow, of Minsk and Kiev, of Minsk and EU? And maybe you could also reflect a little bit on how sanctions played a role in Lukashenko's decision to support Russia in aggression against Ukraine. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alesia. I need to start with mentioning that those questions are that deep and that broad that we need separate discussion on any of them, right? So I will be trying to be brief and maybe give you the understanding of how it was and how it has changed since 2020. So if we're talking about the relations with our main trade partner and main political ally of the Lukashenko's regime, I'm talking about Moscow, then since 2020, the dependence of Lukashenko himself personally and structurally, the economy of Belarus, the political system of Belarus, it has increased its dependence on Moscow many times. Before 2020, Lukashenko was trying to balance his foreign policy, his internal policies with a Western vector that has been destroyed, that was destroyed because of the crackdown on people's protests, the civil society, because of the sanctions that he provoked by his actions. And thus, his relations with Moscow have been becoming, I would say, his positions in a dialogue with Putin, in a dialogue with Russia, has become weaker and weaker. And since those times, he signed the new integration agreements, so-called maps of integration, that means that structurally the Belarusian economy would be relying more and more on the Russian one. He agreed to create so-called educational military centers, which are thought to be proxy bases or mini bases, military bases of Russia. They're not called that time, but like this. But in this education military centers, there will be Russian military personnel and Russian military equipment based on the permanent basis in Belarus. Lukashenko also publicly recognized, which he didn't do since 2014, the legality of annexation of Crimea, saying publicly in one of his interviews that Crimea is de jure and de facto is the territory of Russia. The most important point is that when Belarus got up in February 24, we already had Russian troops in our country concentrated on the border with Ukraine, and Belarus has become an aggressor state just because it allowed to attack Ukraine from its own territory. According to the international law, this don't give you any other ways of understanding what is happening. Belarusian is aggressor state, independently of what Belarusians and people of Belarus think. The illegitimate government made our country the state that attacked the Ukraine. If we talk about Minsk and the EU, this is a pretty maybe easy explanation. The EU has always been interested in a democratic Belarus and a more independent on foreign policy. And we, Belarus and the EU, we have passed through many periods, through many waves of rapprochement and sanctions period. So after all presidential elections, usually Lukashenko found himself under European and American sanctions. The only time when it was not the case was in 2015, when there were no political prisoners in Belarus, or at least internationally recognized political prisoners, and when he falsified elections, but not that much, just because after the revolution and the war, of Russia against Ukraine that started in 2014, that Belarusians were afraid of repeating the same scenario in their own country, so they just relied on their authoritarian regime and voted. Many of them voted for Lukashenko. We don't have any numbers to prove it, but just maybe opinions of people who follow the sociological opinions in Belarus. And in 2020, as it was already mentioned several times, he cracked down on people, and this destroyed the relations with the West. The several packages of sanctions were imposed on Lukashenko. The hardest one, the toughest one, was after this Ryanair incident, when the Ryanair aircraft was landed in Belarus, just because the one of the editors-in-chief of this Telegram channel mentioned by Vasil, Roman Protasevich, he was flying over the territory of Belarus. So the Belarusian KGB, together with the Russian FSB, they decided to detain him, to arrest him, and this provoked the a new, I would say, sanctions period against Belarus. The third wave became after this aggression from Belarus against Ukraine, and we found ourselves under the hardest, the toughest sanctions than ever. And this makes us more and more dependent on Russia. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, that the EU and the Western states shouldn't impose the sanctions, but just the consequence is that Belarus is becoming less and less independent, less and less sovereign, because of what Lukashenko is doing. And I don't have any real opportunity to somehow reproached with the Western states to recover the dialogue with them if Lukashenko doesn't change his tactics inside the country. And he's not going to, it seems. He understood that the only source that can give him political stability inside the country is repressions and police brutality, and also the reliance on Moscow. Talking about Minsk-Kiev, the relations have been, I would say, economically, they were very good economically, but since 2020 it changed politically. So politically, before the elections in 2020, Lukashenko met Zelensky, they hugged each other, they were talking about brotherhood and so on and so forth. But when Lukashenko falsified elections, when he cracked down on people's protests, then on the official level, the Ukrainian government said that they don't recognize his legitimacy as the president, so they were not calling him a president of Belarus. But the relations on the economic sphere, they even became better. So Ukraine continued buying oil products refined from Russian oil, so oil refinery products from Belarus, and the export of Belarusian goods, this oil refineries, they increased 3 times since 2020. Giving Lukashenko's regime additional billions of dollars, also on cracking down the people and supporting the police brutality. So that's why some of the people in the Belarusian democratic movement, they criticize Zelensky because of this realpolitik. But on February 24, this also has changed. I don't know, frankly, we don't have the numbers, independent numbers, how much the beginning of the war influenced this economic relations with the Ukraine. I have seen different statements by Ukrainian and Belarusian officials saying that they continue buying and selling, and the other that they have stopped doing it. So maybe if you have some additional info here, this would be very of my personal interest too. But of course, and it was already said here, the relation on the people's level, the relation between the government, just because of Lukashenko allowed to attack Ukraine, they were almost destroyed. But because of the people who don't support Lukashenko, who support Ukraine, I would say that this was neutralized a bit. We have several battalions in Ukraine fighting for Ukraine for the freedom of this state, and Belarusian army never, at least till now, at the moment, they never entered, never invaded Ukraine, and this gives to Ukrainian people, maybe to the international community, a slightly different perspective on the role of Belarus in the conflict than of Russia.
Thank you, Pavel, for your reflections. That was indeed a good bridge to the next question that I have to Alina. And Alina, I would like to ask you to reflect about what do we know about Ukraine and Ukraine supporting Belarusians after the political crisis of 2020? Because we've heard that Belarusians, one of the countries that was hosting Belarus after the political crisis of 2020 was Ukraine, and that Ukraine introduced some legal measures to support Belarusian refugees in the country. But how would you describe this support, and how can we also describe the attitudes of Ukrainians towards the Belarusian regime, maybe, both when it comes to the people and when it comes to politics? Please.
Thank you very much, Alesia, for your questions. So first of all, I think that it should be mentioned that for many years, Belarus was considered to a large extent by Ukrainians as the country of stability, of certain economic prosperity, and this cliche of being of the low corruptions with good roads, with the good quality products was part of this imaginary structures. Because to a large extent Belarusians and Ukrainians were learning about each other for a long period of time through the prism of Russian TV. It's important to understand. And therefore, this image of Belarus products as having the standards coming from Soviet Union and meaning that they are of very good quality were still alive during the last years. You could have seen it in the commercial brands, like when you see ice cream of Belarus or bread of the product of Belarus being quite utilized in Ukraine. And the second part of this image, this so-called stability or order, was something that people were referring to as well. So it was based on the idea that there is no corruption, and therefore Lukashenko regime was collectively supported in a way that probably he is a little bit provincial person, but still, while Belarusians didn't have protests before 2020, meaning that they were supporting him or they were satisfied, and therefore they were not getting rid of him. If so, that it could be even seen as the model for some of the Ukrainians. And but of course, since 2020, their perception of Belarus and of Lukashenko has been dramatically shifting, and it's also depends very much on the media appearances. However, Lukashenko had quite high support. So if before the protests or revolution in Belarus, so, he had almost 67% of supporters among Ukrainians. So people were replying as they trust this person. Since 2020, Lukashenko had approximately 35% of those who still supported him. This is some data from rating group, but also by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. And these figures are quite interesting because we can understand that much depends on both the professional background of people who answer these questions, on their age, rural, urban area, and so on. But but those probably who still continue consuming Russian TV might get the picture of Belarus and Lukashenko in a positive way. However, as for support that have been done since the protests, I have such data that since August 2020 till July 2021, 3,000 citizens of Belarus received the temporary residence permits and around 500 people permanent residence permits. The similar data was in 2019, where 2,000 people got their temporal residence. However, the majority was using Ukrainian-Belarus border as a transit point. So more than 31,000 citizens of Belarus were going through Ukraine in order to get further to Europe, and this is something that we can reflect more on, because first of all, there could be such aspect that Europe was providing the better conditions, and also maybe Ukraine might have been more dangerous for the activists to stay in, because the proximity to both Belarus and Russia made it easier for different assassins and so on to come to Ukraine and conduct murders, because there were a couple of cases when Pavel Slunkin, the Belarus journalist, was murdered, and the Belarus activist was murdered. So I would say that these attitudes were quite different. There were at the same time centers of Free Belarus opening in Ukraine in 2021, and different cultural projects were reflecting the free will of Belarusians and support of their identity. At the same time, as Pavel mentioned, the realpolitik of Zelensky meant that there were some economic dependency and economic relations with regime were still on after the protests in 2020.
Thank you, Alina. And I think that we can now move on to the recent events, namely the start of the war in Ukraine. Pavel, you have already talked about Belarus being a territory for the aggression against Ukraine. Also, you mentioned that for Lukashenko, the only source of support is basically Russia, and that he's in a way pushed in the corner to support Russia today. But at what cost does this decision to let Russian army in the country comes? What is the price that Lukashenko is paying there?
I will maybe share not analytical, but my personal view here is I think that this is the biggest crime done by the Lukashenko's regime, what he did against Ukraine in February 24, dragging my people, dragging my state that has never been attacking, that never attacked anyone, never tried to occupy any territory, that Belarusians usually repeat themselves and in their conversation that it doesn't matter, that there is a proverb, there is a popular saying that it is okay if the your economic state is not that good, but what is important that there is no war. It is called "Aby nie było wojny," which means may war not be. So, and now we have it. Now we have it just because of what Lukashenko is doing and what he has done. So the price, if we measure it, how can we measure it? This can be a humanitarian level. That the price of being called traitors or being called aggressor state or citizens of an aggressor state. I found my second home in Ukraine. I fled from Belarus to Ukraine, and I I never met a negative, I don't know, approach to me from locals there. Living in Lviv, talking Belarusian with Belarusian language with Ukrainians, and they were answering Ukrainian, and we were communicating just perfectly, just like those so-called brother nations, right? But it has changed since February 24. To be Belarusian in Ukraine, it can be even dangerous. Some people understand that people are not representing their government. Some don't. And I'm not sure when and I will be able to come back to Ukraine again. We should also mention here that the Ukrainian National Bank froze all accounts of Belarusians in Ukrainian banks. So when they needed to flee the war, they didn't have money. If they had this money on bank accounts in Ukraine, so they were punished twice by the Lukashenko regime when they lost their home in Belarus, but then they lost their second home in Ukraine. And for Ukrainian governments, they became also the citizens of an aggressor state, so they didn't really disassociated the regime and the people who were dissidents in the states. So this is like the humanitarian crisis, just several examples of this. On the economic level, I have told you already about the economic sanctions. Those sanctions that were imposed on Belarus since 2020, they were mostly cosmetic till this Ryanair landing in Belarus. Then the EU imposed a real and pretty tough economic sanctions, but they were delayed in time. They were sectorial sanctions, but they I'm not sure that all of the sanctions already are taken place, that they're working already, just because they let the current context to finish, and they are prohibiting to sign any new contracts with the Belarusian companies working in the oil refinery and Kali, how you call it in English? I forgot the word. Sorry.
Potash.
Sorry, yeah, with the Polish industry. So, and the third wave was after the aggression, and Belarusian banks, some of them are out of SWIFT now, and many more will come. This means that, for me, I would say that without any changes in Russia, if in 2020 there were all alternative candidates, all people who wanted to become president, participating in the company, they expected that if they don't do any anti-Russia or very pro-American, pro-European statements, that if they show that they can be pragmatically good both for Russia and the EU and for Belarusian people, then Moscow could close the eyes on any political transition in Belarus and could agree for it. But now we see that the war against Ukraine, it shows that this will never happen. So I would say that now Belarusian future, Belarusian fate is attached to the Russian one. If we don't see any political changes or political destabilization, weakness of the political regime in Russia, I would bet that they will not take place in Belarus. And if Putin regime will survive in the closest years, in the nearest years, I bet that the Belarusian sovereignty will be decreasing more and more, and maybe threatening to our independence. I don't know what will happen, but for sure this won't be Belarus that we have known before 2020. I would say that the sovereignty of Belarus would be more symbolic than a real one.
Thank you, Pavel. And you've earlier mentioned as well that there is this saying in Belarus that anything is okay until we have a war. And then I'm thinking here, now we have a war. Well, basically, not on the territory of Belarus, but Belarusians are suffering from it in a way. Of course, not as Ukrainian population, but those who were placed in Ukraine in the same way, probably. But and therefore, I guess that it explains why Belarusians don't support the war in Ukraine. But I would like just to get again some more details, maybe some more numbers when it comes to attitudes of Belarusians to the war. Vasil, could you give us some overview? How many Belarusians support Lukashenko's decision to back up Russia? Do we have some more details here in data?
Thanks. Yes, there has been indeed two polls, two surveys made by Chatham House, one of them, and another one by Vardamatsky's laboratory, which I have already mentioned. And both of them were conducted in the beginning of March. And this has been, so you can also probably also just take into account that it has been before the events of Bucha and other small cities in Kiev region like surfaced the truth about the atrocities of Russian military became known. So as for Chatham House, according to this survey, 40% of respondents have not been happy with the Russian military being concentrated on Belarusian territory. Still, about 20% support Belarusians have been supporting that, and more than 33% were undecided on the issues. Also, about 41% agreed that Russian military represented threat to Belarus, meaning that both it has been kind of stripping it of its sovereignty, and also because it is known that the Russian military has been active quite. They almost did not abide to any of rules of the Belarusian territory, so they were like. There have been reports of even harassing women in some of the small cities near the Ukrainian border. 33% did not see Russian military as a threat, and 26% were undecided. Also, 39% of Belarusians said that the Russian military should be immediately withdrawn from Belarusian territory. About 29% disagreed with this thesis, and 32% were undecided. Also, it should be, probably you noticed that there has been quite a significant number of people who were undecided. And as the authors of the survey mentioned, this can be explained by the general lower information awareness of Belarusians about the war in Ukraine, meaning that sometimes they do not have reliable information, even though they have internet access. And sometimes they're being fed by the state media TV channels, the propagandists and disinformation materials, which have been boosted by pro-Russian propaganda. Another reason for this high number of undecided is certainly fear that many of Belarusians, they simply afraid to say truth. And given that those polls were conducted over internet, sometimes there is not enough trust to those people who ask you to give them the answer. So also given the high number of repressions with regards to even mentioning the war in Russia, I think that significantly this has been also transferred to Belarusians, because they also kind of has quite a good understanding of what is happening in Russia. So meaning that they understand, they have this perception that, okay, even mentioning of the war could be also something harmful, and it could lead to many problems. I remember personally that there have been very interesting case when two Belarusians were arrested because they were inspecting the bombshell in their personal yards, meaning that they were trying to consider whether they are prepared for something similar to happen in Belarus, as has been happening in the border regions in Russia. You know that Berdyansk oil, the depositories have been also bombed by someone. Okay, probably
Belgorod, you mean?
Yeah, Belgorod. Sorry. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, So fear of repressions is another important factor that makes Belarusians really be afraid to just be reporting undecidedness on the matter. As for Vardamatsky's survey, the poll showed that only every 10th citizen of Belarus supported the possible entry of Belarusian troops into the territory of Ukraine to participate in the war. And also, the higher the level of education of Belarusians, the less support was for this step. Also, the greatest support for the participation of Belarus in the war was among those with secondary incomplete secondary education, 15 and 30% respectively. So, specifically, in general, almost 47% of respondents, according to Vardamatsky's polls, are negative about the current Belarusian government deploying Russian troops in Belarus, but about 45% of respondents support such a decision. You see that there are kind of figures that are similar to the first poll in some respects. So yeah, I mean, majority of Belarusians is clearly against, and you can also see this in the attempts of Belarusians to protest against the war, this anti-war movement. A lot of people have been arrested during the protest actions in Belarus in previous weeks. And also there is like partisan movements within which the activists have been disrupting the railroad connections. And I think that it has been also reported from Ukrainian intelligence or something like that, that this allows to significantly slower the movement of Russian troops and made the occupation of Kiev even not possible, if I'm not mistaken about the conclusions of this report. Right now there have been also the law adopted that makes the death penalty for those Belarusians who participate in these railroad disruptions. And this makes the struggle of Belarusians, of this partisan movement or civic activism movement, I mean, really we could call those people definitely also heroes, because they clearly acknowledge the level of danger that they will face if they do something like this. So yeah, I mean, majority of Belarusians are against the invasion and the war in Ukraine. But yeah, that's how it happened. They could really change little, but they still struggle.
Thank you, Vasil. And I can just add that the numbers are much higher when we talk about the surveys that deal with the protest supporters or with those respondents who have been actively taking part in protests in Belarus in 2020. For example, the independent online survey called National Pool indicates that the majority, it's almost 100% of Belarusians who don't support the aggression against Ukraine, and actually 50% of Belarusians who support the protests are afraid that Ukrainians will perceive them as hostile. And this is one of the major fears regarding the consequences of the war in Ukraine. And now I would like to turn to Alina. Do you think that Belarusians' fears can become a reality? Do you think that now we can talk about Belarusians or Ukrainians think of Belarusians as a hostile nation? Has it somehow changed after the start of the war? What do we know about it?
Yeah, this is a very good question. In my opinion, there does not exist solid image of Belarus, and it is being constructed and reconstructed based on the recent news. Because on one hand, we know that Russian army have been invading Ukraine from Belarus, and the monitoring group Belaruski Gayun have calculated there were more than 600 missile strikes inflicted on Ukraine from the territory of Belarus. And there are some images of Russian soldiers that use Belarus post to send goods they have robbed in Ukraine. However, there is still the opposite and let's say, more optimistic or supportive images of Belarus. For example, when media present Belarus battalions fighting against Russia in Ukraine, according to BBC, there were 200 people. Some other medias mentioned the higher numbers. So it's less about the numbers, but more about the image that, yes, there is the Belarus state, and there is the population which might have different attitudes. And secondly, the image that have been mentioned by the previous speaker, all the partisan movements and the railroad disruptions is something that contributes very much to the perceivement of Belarus population as Ukrainians friends. So I would say that on one hand, if in case of Russia, it is very visible that both the population has been associated with the recipients of war. With Belarus, it's not like that, which is very promising. And moreover, Vasil was mentioning Volodymyrsky survey, and the numbers that I've seen there bring some hope, because even though many of their recipients have answered that they support the Russian actions in Ukraine, but 85% has opposed use of Belarusian troops in Ukraine. And I hope this means that there might be the sabotage or any other action in case Belarus government would decide that they should start bringing Belarus troops to Ukraine. Yeah, so you see, the image is quite contradictory. It's not being fully constructed, and there are much promises that Belarus population would react differently to the government, and this would lead for the Belarusian soldiers not to get to Ukrainian territories.
Thank you, Alina. And both Vasil and Alina have already mentioned some of the actions that Belarusians engage with to promote positive image of Belarus, both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. Pavel, would you give us some more examples of what Belarusians do to support Ukraine today?
Yeah, but I would start and suggest you to start answering this question from, again, describing the conditions in which they are doing this partisan movement. This is important. This was mentioned by Vasil in the first part, but still, to better understand how dangerous it is, I think that we should start with this. So after 2020, an unprecedented wave of repressions was in Belarus. Several hundred thousands of people left Belarus because of the political reasons. Thousands are in prison for political reasons. So we have thousands of political prisoners. Torture and beatings that shocked the world in August 2020, it hasn't disappeared somewhere. It stayed and even became more cruel, but we don't pay that much attention as we did in August 2020. Some political prisoners even tried to kill themselves right during the so-called trial, which is not a trial for sure, by slitting their stomach or piecing their neck with a ballpoint pen. So the last mass protests were crushed back in January 2021. On the propaganda TV, state television, you can see calls for the killing of opponents of Lukashenko. They say it publicly, openly. However, this didn't make Lukashenko more popular. Yeah, he is having around 30% of the support, even though the independent media was almost also destroyed, even for the people who have this internet connection. Without VPN, they don't have a free access. They need to use Telegram channels, and this is also can be dangerous. So people sometimes are stopped by police, their mobile phones are checked, and if they are assigned to Telegram channels that are called extremists, they can get up in prison next day and spend their years. In civil society was almost destroyed. Even the organizations that were involved in protecting the rights of disabled people, ecological organizations or biodiversity, they were all liquidated. Leaders of these organizations, they were arrested or they had to flee. And these are the conditions in which Belarusian society met the war. The illegitimate Lukashenko has made Belarus a co-aggressor state. Its citizens that were already under a huge pressure from the government because of these repressions, they are now seen by the international community. Those who don't follow much the Belarusian developments, they are seen as traitors, occupants. This has changed their attitude to the Belarusians very much. In 2020, that the Belarusians were seen as the hope for the democracy in Europe, and now we are seen much differently. Independent polls, as you know, they show that Belarusians don't support the war. Anti-war sentiments are much higher in Belarus than pro-war sentiments. Since the beginning of the war, so since February 24, more than 1,500 people have been arrested for anti-war actions. And now switching to the anti-war partisan movement, it has revived in Belarus, which has been symbol of our country since World War II. You know that in World War II, the partisan movement was very, very strong in Belarus, fighting the Nazi regime. Now Belarusians remember what their grandfathers did and try to fight with the Lukashenko's regime with new technical ways, maybe ways. They don't bomb the railway communication, but they block the movement of Russian military equipment, destroy the electric system, burn them, the electric systems that can be preventing freight trains from transporting troops and equipment from Belarus to Ukraine. Because of this partisan actions, Russians had to switch to trucks from the railway and sometimes even to air transport. Belarusian cyber partisans, they attack databases and train management systems, website of state institutions, and this also slowed down significantly, or even in some cases broke the supply chains and replenishment of Russia's attacking troops. Belarusians share massively information about the deployment and movement of Russian troops and equipment. The information about departure of Russian warplanes was immediately published and is immediately published. And this allows Ukraine air defense systems, Ukrainian army to be ready for the attacks. A special monitoring tool was created to gather info and share it with the UA army and with public. According to its creators, they receive around 1,000 messages a day about the details of Russia's movement, and they share this information with the Ukrainian side. According to some war analysts, all this that I mentioned, this added and helped very much the Ukraine to defend Kiev, as the shortest road on Kiev is from Belarus. And this was very important, not let encircling it and effectively attacking it. several Belarusian battalions joined the war in Ukraine, in the side of Ukraine. They're fighting for the freedom of Ukraine. The Belarusian battalion was the first national battalion in the Ukrainian army. There was an international one, but Belarusian was a separate national one. Belarusian soldiers died. We have several cases when Belarusian soldiers died already, also protecting Bucha, fighting in Bucha. But this is not the only part. Belarusians also created dozens of initiatives to support the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian refugees. Thanks to them, Ukrainian army and these battalions, they have received new vehicles, also military vehicles and weapons. They help refugees financially and provide them with medical help, psychological support, and service assistance. And I would maybe mention here the initiative that helps to the Ukrainian women that were raped by the Russian soldiers, and this initiative helps medically and psychologically to the victims of this, and this was found by Belarusians. I even saw Ukrainians sharing these initiatives and advising among them to apply for their help. An important feature of all this is that these initiatives are predominantly in exile since 2020. They are led by the same people who have been proven themselves 2 years ago, those who fled Belarus because of the political persecution. But even inside Belarus, even despite this dangerous danger, the Belarusians help Ukrainian refugees. They provide them with free services. They help them with housing, hosting them in their homes. They help with evacuation to the European Union and collect money for them. So from my perspective, these resistant actions and also broad popular anti-war sentiment were one of the reasons why Lukashenko didn't send the Belarusian army to Ukraine.
Thank you, Pavel, for this detailed overview. And we'll just have 2 last questions here, and I would like to ask speakers to respond briefly. First comes to Alina. Alina, considering what was said, what else do you think Belarusians should do to support Ukraine? What is that Belarusians are missing?
I don't think that there is something that Belarusians are missing, and as well as other international communities, I see the strong support of Ukraine and Ukrainians abroad. And here I can just maybe rely on my activist part of the identity and say that when we, as Nordic Ukraine Forum, organize demonstrations every weekend in support of Ukraine, I see a lot of people from Belarus communities who regularly come, and also their leaders of the organization that clearly express their opinion on the situation. I think it's very correct way of actions. And as for the Belarus community that lives in Sweden, I've seen their initiatives when people make their exhibitions for Ukrainians or make some supportive activities. This is all what counts. That's very good. And as all others, what can be do further is just to help Ukraine to win, meaning do what we can, support, donate, volunteer, write expert articles or whatever you can based on your professional background. And I hope that also we could rely much on the very complex conditions of the Belarus partisans, but in Belarus. But I hope that that would be something of much help to support Ukraine and its victory. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. Let's hope for that indeed. And the last question comes to Vasil. What do you think the international community should do for Belarus now in the circumstances when all eyes are on Ukraine? What should be done by the international community?
Thank you, Alesia. I will try to up to the point. First of all, certainly Ukraine is the forefront of international agenda, and this is totally fair. I mean, this is the degree of sufferings that been experienced by Ukrainians is just it's such high that that's all help should be definitely first of all be given to them, but. Also, I think that what is important for international community is not to kind of forget about the Belarusian agenda and all those people who were struggling with the Lukashenko's regime, and all those who also were and are trying to support Ukrainians war refugees and also just do their best into contributing to just withstanding Russia's aggressions. So I think that first of all, international community should be aware of the efforts and of all those diverse initiatives and support that is being done by the Belarusian activists. That's those which were mentioned so thoroughly by Pavel. I think this is the first thing, and the second is certainly to differentiate between civil society, civic activists, Belarusians, and the Belarusian state. And I know that larger parts of international community indeed have this distinction in mind. Last week I was speaking to European decision makers, and the first thing that they said, we acknowledge this, and definitely we will also try our best to help you. And one of the things that I also really liked is maybe quite a simplistic and maybe too pragmatic approach by one of the European decision makers. I'm not sure if I can call his name here, but still I will just mention the thesis that he mentioned, is that we need to invest and allocate more money to the Belarusian civic activists, because they already have experience in doing what they do. They have spent 2 years of helping and launching various kinds of initiatives, creative initiatives, which really effective, and they help a lot of people. So I would also be subscribing under this thesis, just help both on rhetorical and financial level. And I think that for Belarusian civic activists and civil society, this could be enough for continuing their efforts. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Vasil. And with your concluding words, I would like to thank to our viewers here, to thank to the speakers, to Pavel, to Alina, to Vasil, who were helping us today to reflect on the very important and topical issue when it comes to Belarusian attitudes towards the war in Ukraine. We discussed how Belarusians help Ukraine, what are the attitudes of Ukrainians towards the Belarusians before and after the war, and finally, what are the implications of regime's participation in the aggression against Ukraine. If you like this webinar, please share it with your network. And once again, thank you ForumCiv for organizing this event. And everyone, wish you a good day, and let's hope for the quick victory of Ukraine.